Okay, hi everyone. Welcome again to our fourth seminar, fourth interview to an expert in the framework of this EUKIT project, in the framework of our course on new trends in global trade governance. Today we have with us Professor Ramon Pacheco Pardo, who is director of the Korea Chair of the Brussels School of Governance Research Institute, which is supported by both the Korean Foundation and the Vrije Universiteit Brussels in the heart of the European capital. And he's also a lecturer on international relations at King's College in London. He's an expert. He's an outstanding expert on what we could refer as Korean affairs on a very broad reference, right? He has written plenty of academic work, and he has been involved in many research projects on all these issues, not only on the Korean Peninsula, but also on the Northeast Asian affairs, and also in the relations between East Asian and the European Union. He also served as policy advisor and policy commentator for some institutions such as the European Parliament. For all these reasons, we considered he was an unbeatable key speaker for joining us today to talk about the EU Korea, the EU Republic of Korea Free Trade Agreement. So thank you very much, Professor Pacheco, for joining us. 안녕하세요.
안녕하세요. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure and an honor. As we already checked and comment, we want these talks to be as informal as possible, right? I'll be asking you a couple of starting questions, and afterwards, our students are more than invited to jump in and fire you with their own questions. I'm delighted to see that some students which are not enrolled in the course today also join the session, so that's great. But let's go down to business, Ramon. I think it's widely known that the Republic of Korea is part of one of the most unstable regional balance of powers in global politics, right? But this has not prevented the Republic of Korea, South Korea, as we usually say in Spanish, to become a full democracy and to become a very dynamic economy, in contrast to North Korea. As a starting point, Professor, could you please trace back for us this institutional and economic evolution of South Korea, of Korea, since the end of the civilian war in 1953? How and why, if I may, was the Republic of Korea so successful in joining the international community? What factors can help us to explain this incorporation of Korea to the international community? Thank you.
Yes, thanks. I think there are three key factors. The first one, you had governments that were very involved in economic policy making in the 1950s, but especially from the 1960s onwards, where it was obviously dictatorial governments. Later on, the Park Geun-hye government, and later on, since 1987, we had the transition to democracy, and we have had both liberal and conservative governments. But even after the transition to democracy, there has been this, I wouldn't call it a state interventionism, but work between the state and the private sector. And I will talk more about the private sector later on. And you have seen how they have been focusing on macroeconomic components of policymaking, but also I would say that also on the microeconomic management when necessary. Obviously, this has become less or not as easy to do as the country has become more developed. Obviously, we go back to the 1950s, and especially, as I said, from the 1960s onwards, 1960s, 1970s, there was a degree of micro-intervention in the economy. For example, which companies were allocated credit, for example, which sectors was the country going to develop, like the term to develop the shipbuilding sector from the late 1960s, 1970s onwards. So you have this degree of interventionism. But secondly, I think we need to add that the South Korean society has always been very entrepreneurial. So we have the chaebol, the big conglomerates that everybody knows about today, Samsung, LG, Hyundai, right? In Korea itself, you might have ESCI, for example, too, that maybe is not as well known overseas, Lotte as well. So this big chaebol, they started as a small family-run enterprises, and little by little they started to grow. So they received state support in the 1960s, 1970s, but you had these entrepreneurs that had decided to launch companies and to branch out into different sectors. Later on, from the 1980s onwards, and I would say especially since the Asian financial crisis of 1997, entrepreneurship, support for entrepreneurship has become even more prominent in Korea, and you have seen a huge increase in the number of small, medium-sized enterprises that are the biggest employers there. I'm very willing to, as I said, branch out, but also to innovate, move into new technologies, for example, and we can talk more about that later on. And I think the third factor that was quite important in the economic development of South Korea was the fact that there was this coalition, formal coalition in some respects, but also informal, between the government, between the business people, and the financial sector as well, and also to an extent with workers, right? As I said, in some aspects it was formal because you would have formal consultation, for example, between business people and government. Sometimes would be informal, for example, between the government and labor. Sometimes, obviously, there was confrontational. Workers from the 1970s onwards, they were willing to go on a strike when necessary, but there was also a degree of cooperation between these different groups, also with the banking sector that was state-owned, but eventually when the banking sector became private, there was also this degree of cooperation. And this is something that has not fully disappeared from Korea today. This cooperation between the different actors that are part of the economy, and that has helped in moments of crisis. For example, 1997, 1998, you saw cooperation between the different economic actors. But even if you go back to the 1960s, 1970s, or the year 1979, 1980, when there was an economic crisis in South Korea, this cooperation between the different actors allowed the country to continue to grow. So I think you have these factors. And surrounding all this, there has been the orientation towards exports. Going all the way back to the 1960s, the governments of South Korea and the business people in South Korea understood that the market in South Korea was not big enough to sustain the economy. The population was not as big as Japan. Later on China, obviously, when China started to open up, and there was this focus on exports. And that's something that continues all the way until today. And if you interview or you talk to business people, to academics, and to government policymakers in the country, this export orientation continues and hasn't disappeared.
So interesting. Thank you very much. I don't know if you noticed it, but I smile when you refer to the shipbuilding sector, which is one of the big sectors as far as I know, in Korea, and has created a kind of rivalry with the Spanish shipbuilding sector. Actually, some Spanish shipbuilders complain about this, complain about this new incomer in the sector in the 70s and 80s. So, yeah, I think you help us to cover this 50, 60 years of contemporary Korean history, because that's true. Korea it's a non-fully well-known country, non-fully well-known actor economy in at least from our perspective. Good, and I'm also glad, Ramon, that you mentioned the chaebol. Could you please dig deeper on this concept? Because as you know, we're in a business school, and unfortunately enough, sadly enough, our students are not very familiar with this industrial and financial conglomerates, right? And I think it's quite interesting from different points of view. What are chaebols, and what is their relationship with the state and the evolution, this historical evolution you just described us?
I think the chaebol remain the main economic actor in South Korea, right? You're right that we don't know them as much across Europe, really. We don't know them as much because we're not used to it. We have big companies, but we don't have these really big conglomerates that you see in South Korea. So these are essentially big conglomerates that span all different types of sectors. So if I mention Samsung, I mean, all students will know the mobile phones, right? But they won't know that in Korea, for example, Samsung also has, for example, an insurance company, right? It has some 40 businesses spanning all different types of sectors. If I mention LG, for example, LG will be known also because of the flat TV screens for many in Europe, right? And including Barcelona as well, obviously, right? But many people won't know that in South Korea it has corner shops, right? Supermarkets, right? Small corner shops as well. So these are very big conglomerates that, as I say, span many different sectors, 40, 50, 60, the biggest chaebol, different sectors that are under the ownership of a family, right? So it would be, if we bring it to a Spanish context, right? If it would be like if the Amancio Ortega family, for example, was involved in 60 different sectors, right? And not only Zara or clothing, but for example, also had, as I said before, an insurance company as well. Under the name Zara, right? That's what we were talking about, and they were crucial in the economic development of the country, because without the chaebol, it would have been very difficult for South Korean companies to compete against foreign competitors, right? They wouldn't have had the scale when the country started to open up in the 60s, but especially from the 1980s onwards to foreign investors and foreign companies from Japan, from the US, from Western Europe as well. They wouldn't have been able to compete, but they were able thanks to the size that they had, right? So what you see here is that there is these big conglomerates that supported the economic development of the country, but they had a very close relationship with the government, right? There was a lot of corruption taking place as well, as you can imagine, because these companies were so important, in terms of the economic growth of the country, but B, also in terms of employment, because until the 1980s, not all South Korean workers, but many South Korean workers were employed by the chaebol, and the chaebol also employed indirectly many other South Korean workers during the development phase, right? So there was this corruption, the close links with governments. There were bribes, for example, to government officials, also to the banking sector as well. Then in the 1990s, you see the financial crisis of 1997. Every single democratic South Korean government has run on a platform of reining on the chaebols, on regulating the chaebols, but they have never done this. And this is a result of the influence that they still have on the economy of the country. They continue to be the main exporters from South Korea. So around 50 to 60% of South Korean exports are in the hands of 5 or 6 big chaebol, right? The ones that I've mentioned, LG, Hyundai, Samsung, SK is also very important. POSCO as well. POSCO is technically it's a state-owned company, not necessarily a chaebol, but is usually included with the chaebol, right? So you have these big firms that dominate the economy in terms of exports. They don't dominate in terms of employment anymore. More or less 85% of South Koreans are employed in small, medium-sized enterprises, but indirectly, even many South Koreans employed in the smaller companies, they depend on the exports by chaebol because they provide goods or services to the chaebol or to workers in chaebol, and then they are exporting, right? So it's something that at a global level probably can only be compared with the Japanese keiretsu, which is a very similar structure. The main difference is that the keiretsu in Japan, they own banks as well. So for example, you have a Mitsubishi Bank. In the case of South Korea, the chaebol, they don't own banks, right? Banks are separate entities. So this creates some distance between the financial sector and the chaebol themselves, but they do dominate the economy.
Wow, so an interesting actor. I was tempted to ask if they also have their own political parties, but I think that they actually provide. I mean, are in close contact with the main political parties in Korea. So interesting, so interesting. Thank you very much. To be honest, I took a look at the wonderful website you have in the Korea Chair I referred previously in your introduction. There is a section where you present some timelines, which are of paramount help. They condense a lot of information in a very simple way. So that's a word recommendation for all of our audience to take a look at these timelines. It is. I mean, if we go to one of these timelines, it's clearly shown that the diplomatic relationship between the European Union, I mean, back in time, the European communities and the Republic of Korea was created back in 1963, if I am not wrong. I have my own notes, but I mean, it's not a quiz, not at all. However, I was surprised that it was not until 1996 when we see the signature of a first trade, commercial agreement and cooperation agreement between the European Union and South Korea. However, as you mentioned before, just after the signature of this trade and cooperation agreement, the financial crisis outbroke in East Asia, right? The famous five tigers were dramatically impacted by this financial crisis. What was the impact actually of this crisis in the relationship between Korea and the European Union? Because I have the feeling that perhaps it was a go and backwards movement, right? I think that everything got blocked from overnight. How was it?
Yes, it was. Yes, it was a dramatic impact on South Korea as a whole, right? On relations with the EU as well. You could argue change the economic paradigm in South Korea towards full focus on innovation from the Kim Dae-jung government 1998 onwards, and that hasn't changed, right? And in terms of relations with the European Union, 1996 is when South Korea had just joined the OECD, so it had become part of the rich country club, right? The second Asian country only to join after Japan, right? So it was a moment of celebration in South Korea, and exactly 1 year later, it had to go to the IMF for the bailout package in 1997. And interestingly, the European Union, European companies, European countries had started to strengthen economic links with South Korea dating back to the 1980s, right? In the 1980s, we start to see some Korean factories opening in Europe, but also European companies starting to export to South Korea as well. And in the 1990s, we have seen European banks, Western European banks, especially from Germany, France, and the UK, providing credit to the South Korean economy, or to banks that were providing credit to the South Korean economy, right? So Europe was impacted by the crisis. It was impacted because South Korea was becoming an increasingly important market for European goods, the second biggest in Asia back then, because European banks have been providing credit directly or indirectly to South Korean firms, and South Korean firms were not able to pay back this credit, right? And also the agreement had been signed, as you correctly point out, in 1996, because the idea was there was going to be more cooperation in the area of trade between South Korea and the European Union. Basically, that we were going to reduce tariffs in both directions to facilitate trade between both countries, right? Because this was only 1 year after the WTO was launched as well, right? So South Korea and the EU wanted to go further. So the European banks, European companies suffer directly as a result of the crisis, and the European Union was among the countries or among the institutions that provided a bailout package and economic support to South Korea, so that it could recover from the crisis more quickly, as it did, right? So from a political point of view, the South Korean government, the Kim Dae-jung government back then, was thankful to Europe for the support that it had provided. So from a political point of view, this brought better relations, but it is true that from economic relations, the links, trade links and investment links were set back by a number of years because the South Korean economy suffered essentially its biggest recession ever, its biggest recession since the Korean War, as a result of the 1997 crisis, even bigger than the crisis of last year, as a result, the recession of last year as a result of COVID.
Well, while hearing to you, I was thinking if, because I mean, we're here today not to talk about the past, but to talk about the present, the future relationships within the European Union and Korea. And because actually now, I mean, now in 2021, we are celebrating the 10th anniversary of the EU-Korea Free Trade Agreement, which is considered the first new generation trade agreement with an Asian nation, which is for the European Union, I mean, which is actually a very, very significant step in the EU trade policy in such, right? Do you think that those points in time, I mean, those agreements are connected to each other? This, I mean, I was very surprised it sounded me very, very interesting when you said that the Korean government was greatly thankful to the European countries and the European companies in regards to this help, to the provision of this help during the crisis, the financial crisis back in the 90s, 96, 97, 7, 8. So do you think that those agreements are connected to each other, so that there is a kind of continuum between the agreement in 1996 and the fact that the European Union decided to opt for concluding a new generation trade agreement with an old friend, if I may, in Asia as Korea?
Yeah, there is a link, and it's a very interesting link, because after the crisis, right, in 2003, there was a new government in South Korea, and realized that one of the ways to avoid a future crisis was to have as many bilateral trade agreements as possible, right? And this was under the next administration, the Roh Moo-hyun administration, right? And And what you saw is that it reached out to the European Union in 2004, 2005, to negotiate a bilateral FTA. But back then, the European Union hasn't launched its new global strategy, right? That only came about in 2006. So it wasn't interested. The European Union was still deciding on its trade strategy, right? But then as soon as the global strategy was launched in 2006, that included among the policies to sign as many bilateral FTAs as with key partners as possible, South Korea was one of the first countries that the European reached out to try to have a bilateral FTA, right? So both parties had the interest there. And not only this, the European wanted to have so-called new generation FTAs, right? That include services, that includes investment measures, that includes environmental standards, labor standards, so that go beyond tariffs only, right? And South Korea was willing to do this. South Korea was willing to do this because by then the economy had recovered from the crisis. It had become a fairly developed economy, very much focused on tech, right? So it was ready to sign these new generation FTAs. The European also reached out to other Asian countries that were not willing to do this, right? But in the case of South Korea, it was willing to do so, and this was the first ever new generation FTA for the European Union. So if you look at the subsequent FTAs with Canada, with Singapore, with Japan as well, they are not a copy-paste of the Korea FTA, but they are strongly based. They closely follow the South Korea FTA, right? And in some cases, it's a copy-paste, actually. Yeah. They have replaced South Korea or Republic of Korea with Japan, Singapore, Canada, right? And as a result was the political goodwill that was there on both sides to have this FTA, and the fact that both of them thought that they would benefit from this. In the case of the European Union, right, because services was included, and European services firms like legal services firms, financial services firms, they saw the Korean market as an opportunity, and they have actually benefited from the FTA in this respect. For South Korea, it was more manufacturers that wanted to export more cheaply to the European Union, so car making companies, for example, shipbuilding companies as well. And also interestingly, even though there was this goodwill, in the case of South Korea, it also played the US against the European Union, because when the European Union said in the first instance that it was not ready to negotiate an FTA, the US actually wanted to negotiate an FTA with South Korea. This was under in 2007, right? It wanted to negotiate an FTA with South Korea. It signed the FTA very quickly, but then US Congress refused to approve the FTA. Then afterwards, the EU-Korea FTA was signed and entered into force very quickly. The European EU member states agreed that it was going to be implemented on a provisional basis. Same with the European Parliament. And then South Korea was able to slightly renegotiate this FTA with the US because there were certain issues that he had been able to achieve with the European Union that the US hadn't been willing to give on the first negotiation round, and then when there was a second negotiation round under the Obama administration. So in a sense, South Korea was also able to play the US against the European Union. So there was also this very interesting political component during the negotiation process.
So true, so true. So if I understand it right, Korea played like two games, run two games in parallel, right? Using one FTA as a token of a change for the other, trying to get to make their best on both sides.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I can imagine. I can imagine, but I always insist on the fact that trade policy has turned into trade politics, and nowadays we are witnessing part of the substantial external action of the union of the union and other actors in the world, not only on the military component but also on trade. So this is what I try to. This is why I try to convince our students that they are called to play great roles in the coming future.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, so many interesting things, Ramon. Thank you very much for all this broad and very comprehensive vision you are sharing with us today. So I wrote down in my notes to just a reminder. What do you? Because it has been partially covered, but because you refer to the German and French and British interests. I mean, the banking system at least. The European Union, when the European Union deals with a third party in trade negotiations, the European Union tries to speak with one single voice. It's not Brussels plus Den Haag plus Paris plus Lisbon who speak on their behalf, but it's the Commission who runs the negotiations and who tries to bring all interests together. But at the same time, we cannot avoid that the European Union is composed of 27 member states, very different from each other. To your perspective, what are the key national partners? I mean, the key members of the European Union that have most clear interest in Korea and the other way around. Perhaps we can be surprised because, as you put it, very clearly, Korea is now a very tech-focused economy, and perhaps it's Estonia, which is also a very an only tech hub in the union. But what are your thoughts on that? What are the main national interests in the European Union regards Korea and the other way around?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question, right? Because you're right that some member states benefited much more from the FTA than others, right? And I mean, I mentioned before how South Korea played the US against the European Union, but obviously South Korea, being the smaller economy, had to make more concessions to the EU than vice versa, right? This tends to happen with EU FTAs, that the other party tends to have to make more concessions. And South Korea was no exception here. So I would say that there are three sectors on which the EU has benefited the most, and this tells us which member states have benefited the most. One of them is cars. The South Korean market, not the market necessarily, but consumers actually, they used to be very protectionist. They used to buy only South Korean cars. I lived in Korea a couple of times. The first time was 2003, 2004, and it was very difficult to find a foreign car in South Korea, right? And then you go to Japan, all countries where cars were Japanese, right? So similar structure applies, similar relationship applies to Japan, because I want to compare both of them. Now with the FTA, suddenly you see a huge increase in the number of European cars in South Korea because they became cheaper, right? Tariffs were removed. And there was no discrimination against European cars. So now if you go to South Korea, right, you will see that German cars especially, Mercedes, BMWs, right, they have become much more common than they were in the past. Sometimes you also find French cars, Minis as well from the UK when it was part of the European Union, but these brands are less successful in South Korea. And I mentioned the example because obviously this means that Germany has benefited greatly, and we all know about cars, but related to cars, the export of machinery, right, that is used in factories for industrial production have also increased, and many of these machines actually come from Germany as well, to an extent from France too, but especially from and Italy as well, but most of them come from Germany, right? So this type of goods, you know, high-end goods, high-tech goods, cars, machinery used in production, have benefited from the FTA, and this means that Germany has benefited. But of course, Germany doesn't have the production chains, right? The manufacturing chains that German companies use are pan-European, and many Central and Eastern European states have also benefited because they produce some of the intermediate goods that then go to Germany, right? And then the car or the machinery is exported to South Korea. So you see how these countries have benefited. Second sector is food stuff, so agricultural products. The first time I lived in South Korea was very interesting because this was right after South Korea had signed its first ever FTA with Chile, right? And it was fairly easy to find Chilean wine, Chilean seafood, Chilean agricultural products in South Korean supermarkets, but it was very difficult to find European products, including Spanish wine, for example, right? Um, and Spanish ham products, for example. It was extremely difficult. You had to go to special supermarkets to find them, like luxury supermarkets, literally.
Mm-hmm.
It was very expensive to buy these, right? Now with the FTA, you go to South Korea, you go to a corner shop, right? Right next to where you are staying, to where you're living, and you can find expensive Spanish wine, you can find cheap Spanish wine. Same for Italy, same for Germany, same for, as I mentioned, ham and other Spanish food stuff that we export to South Korea as well, right? So this has benefited from the FTA. You know, if you look at the phytosanitary measures, they have been harmonized between the European and South Korea, right? So certificates issued by the European Union are accepted in South Korea. This has also become cheaper. So there's no protectionism on the Korean side, and this has benefited Spain, France, Italy, countries that are strong exporters of this type of food stuff. And thirdly, services. Services firms. Funnily enough, the UK was the country that benefited the most, so now it's going to suffer because it left the European Union. But you have legal firms, European legal firms that opened in South Korea, and they cannot be discriminated against. They have to be treated as domestic firms. Same with financial firms, wealth management, for example. So the first ever European wealth management, family wealth management firm opened some 5 or 6 years ago, thanks to the FTA, right? So you have these services on the European side that have benefited, and the countries that are strongest in services, the UK when it was part of the European Union, but also now France, Netherlands, Ireland probably is going to benefit now that the UK has left the European Union, is going to get some of this business, are benefiting thanks to the FTA, right? So many countries, really, many member states have benefited from the FTA. If you look at the other direction, you see that South Korea has boosted the export of high-tech goods, cars, mobile phones, flat screen TVs, ships as well. We mentioned the shipbuilding industry before. Now 5G, right? With the protectionism against Huawei, Samsung is going to benefit, for example, when European countries develop the 5G network. Now in South Korea, they are developing actually 6G. So probably they will benefit from the 6G exports as well, right? 6G technology. And they have, these type of companies have benefited. But I would also add that Central Eastern European member states have also benefited because many Korean companies have been opening factories in Europe. This was before the FTA. This already started before the FTA, but this has accelerated as a result of the FTA. So if you look at Hungary, if you look at Romania, Poland especially, Slovakia as well, in some of these countries, such as Poland, for example, the biggest foreign investor is actually South Korea, and they build factories, right? So car making factories, mobile phone making factories, all these tech goods, right? They not necessarily come from South Korea anymore. They are from South Korean companies, but they're being manufactured inside the European Union, and especially, as I mentioned, in these Central Eastern European states. So it's a very complex relationship. One last sector to mention is cultural exports. I think, I mean, when I went to South Korea, I mean, I lived there a couple of times. Second time in 2008. In Europe, we didn't know about K-pop, we didn't know about K-dramas or Korean cinema, right? I mean, some people knew, very few people knew about this, right? If you wanted to watch a Korean cinema, which I did back when I came back from Korea the first time, you had to go to a special cinema, right? And where it was somewhere in the outskirts of the city, right? So nobody went to there, right? Now this has completely changed. We don't know about Korean movies. Many young European kids, right, teenagers, they actually listen to K-pop, right? Many of my students in London, they take my classes because they're interested in K-pop, right? So it's a complete change from the past, or even Korean dramas. And these cultural exports, they also now I wouldn't say they're not directly linked to the FTA, but they also benefited from the FTA because cultural exports and cultural relations, if we move beyond the FTA and we look at the Strategic Partnership Agreement, were part of the deal with the European Union. So this allowed the Korean government to promote these cultural exports inside Europe, right? So you had, for example, film festivals, you had, for example, K-pop festivals as well, some 10 years ago when they started in Europe, that were facilitated by the FTA as well.
That's very interesting, and I was thinking of this marvelous film, Parasite. Parasite? I think it was translated. That's a must, guys. If you haven't watched it yet, no one will pass the course without without knowing the story behind this film. No, just kidding. But that's very interesting that you mentioned the cultural sector, because these new generation free trade agreements are more and more facilitating this kind of exchanges, economic and trade exchanges. And we usually tend to forget about those sectors when people think, when the average layman thinks of a free trade agreement, we usually think of exchange of goods. But now this generation, these new generation free trade agreements facilitate enormously the exchange of services and, of course, these cultural goods. So, like it or not, I mean, like the K-pop or not, this is an element. This is an element that helps us to understand this comprehensive agreement, because I do think that it goes far beyond the commercial and trade economic interest. It's in real a strategic partnership because of the many problems around that spin around the Korean Peninsula and this regional balance of power, right? So the European Union once again uses, and you will please correct me, but uses this economic and trade focus not only to deal with economic and trade issues, but to go beyond the simple trade interest. Is it correct?
Yeah, I'm absolutely right. Yeah, you're right. Yes.
I'm just a political scientist. I always tend to analyze things from a political perspective. But yeah, I think it's quite an evident example of how the European Union mix together trade and non-trade interest in one single strategic partnership with a key actor. Thank you very much, Ramon. It's 10 to 2. I could say that perhaps it's time to open the floor to our audience. So, as usual, people do not hesitate to raise your online hands, to use this icon in order to ask for the floor, and ask your own questions to Professor Pacheco. Caleb, please go ahead.
I cannot hear. I don't know if it's me, but I cannot hear anything.
Me neither, Caleb.
Okay.
Okay. Just write your question down and. Well, you cannot. That's my fault then. It should work because you should have access.
Oh, yes, it says we're not able to activate our micros. Yeah.
That's weird because it should work. Can you try it again? I'm not a tech geek, so I'm not a tech savvy at all. There is no icon. That's okay. Please, not to waste, in order not to waste our key speakers' time. Caleb, could you mind to write the question down and on the chat, and then I'll read it out loudly.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, and sorry for the inconveniences. I do prefer you to use the mics, but. I think I found it. I think I found it. Do you see the icon now?
Can you hear me?
Excellent.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, perfectly. Thank you, Caleb.
So I was wondering, you said at the beginning that this agreement between EU and Korea was sort of a first thing, and that some other agreements, for example, the Canadian one, was also based on this more or less. Do you also see this cultural exchange that you just mentioned in these agreements more than to the previous free trading agreements? Or is this like a sole thing that happened between the EU and Korea?
No, I think if you go back to the negotiation process and you talk to negotiators on the European side, and actually the president of my institute in Brussels, Karel de Gucht, he was the trade commissioner when the FTA with South Korea was negotiated, right? So I've discussed this with him at length. They use South Korea as a model of what it wanted to achieve with other countries as well, right? So it wanted the South Korean FTA to be the example of the FTA that it will ask other developed countries to sign. That's why it also went first with South Korea, not only because it was an important trading partner, one of the top 10, but also because it is one of the countries with which the EU has a good political relationship, right? So it wanted to start with a country with which there were no political problems, as is the case obviously with Canada, with Japan, or with Singapore. But it was also a country that wanted to use an FTA that wanted to use as a model to transpose to other countries. Also, South Korea is a developed economy, right? So the EU thought that it would be easier to negotiate a comprehensive FTA with a developed economy as opposed to a developing economy that, for example, might want to protect the agricultural sector. And actually, the European Union launched negotiations with ASEAN and with India at the same time as it launched them with South Korea. But it doesn't have an FTA with any of these two economies. It doesn't have an FTA with India or with ASEAN today. And this was because of disagreements about labor standards, environmental standards, the agricultural sector, intellectual property rights. There were many issues, right? And with South Korea, there were no issues because the standards were fairly similar, right? So it was a case of tweaking the standards. So it applies well to other developed economies. And actually, if you look at the other FTAs that I mentioned, they're very similar. If you look at the negotiations with Australia, the FTA with Australia is going to be and with New Zealand as well, actually, is going to be very similar to the EU Korea FTA. It's not going to be very different. But even if you look at developing economies, because the EU signed an FTA with Vietnam during this period of time, you've seen how the Korea FTA was a model to, even though Vietnam is a developing country, but Vietnam agreed to accept all these standards, labor standards, environmental standards, even human rights are included as part of the FTA. And Vietnam agreed to this because it wants to become a more developed economy and it wants access to the European market, right? But then there are other countries that rejected this. So in a sense, for the European Union, this model has worked well even for developing countries that are willing to improve their standards and follow more the European model, so to speak. And going back to the politics, as I said, because there were no political problems with these countries, right? So countries with which there are no political problems, it's easy to replicate this FTA. There's one other aspect to this, which is the FTA with South Korea. The EU now would like to renegotiate, not renegotiate it, we call it upgrading, right? To upgrade the FTA, because, for example, e-commerce is not included in the FTA because e-commerce wasn't such a big issue when it was negotiated, right? 12 years ago, when they started negotiations, 12, 13 years ago, nobody thought that e-commerce was going to become as big as it is today, right? And even before the pandemic, it was very big, right? So there are these issues that now the EU wants to as it says, upgrade the FTA with Korea. And you actually see that the upgrading process to an extent is been more difficult than the first negotiation process, even though the changes are smaller, right? Because at this stage, the other party, in this case, South Korea, has other priorities, right? So this is also something that the EU learned from the Korea FTA, that you have to include as many things as possible, because later on, if you want to upgrade the FTA, never mind renegotiating it, the other party might have other priorities and might be less willing to engage in a negotiation process for an FTA that it already has in place and where there are only going to be some tweaks. So it might decide to focus on other trade negotiations, and this is what South Korea has been doing in recent years. So you see how when it comes, for example, to the Australia FTA or before the Japan and Canada FTA, the European Union pressed very hard to include as many things as possible, so it didn't have to later on in 10 years' time reopen the FTA with these countries, because it learned a lesson from South Korea, actually, from the case of South Korea.
I muted my mic. That's really relevant, Ramon. This idea that the European Union learned how to deal with third parties on the basis of this FTA with South Korea, right? That's, I was thinking on the FTA with Singapore, where everything was including one single text, and then there were some problems in regards the non-exclusive competences of the Union, and then the European Parliament, the Court of Justice of the European Union had to publish their opinion, and the free trade agreement risked to get blocked at this very stage, and this helps us to understand how the European Union, as an actor in the international scene, adapts itself, and it's in a continuous learning process. And this is quite relevant with what you share. I mean, this is very relevant what you shared with us in regards to the Korean FTA. I mean, the FTA with South Korea. Okay, more questions, people. Let's take advantage of Ramon's presence today. Okay, Jabin, please go ahead.
Hello. Like in a situation where protectionism is prominent and the value chain is changing due to pandemic situation, how can Korea or Europe strategically use the agreement in this situation when changes in the value chain around the world and the reshoring phenomenon has been noticeable? Like for example, if I run a Korean company, would it be more beneficial to produce and sell it in Europe, or would it be more beneficial to use the global FTA by producing it in another country that has agreed with Europe country?
So I think that's an interesting point, right? Because if you look at in the case of South Korean companies, right? Before the pandemic, they had already started outsourcing to Europe, right? The countries that I mentioned before in Central and Eastern Europe. But increasingly what you see with South Korean companies is after the FTA between Vietnam and Korea, and the EU also has an FTA with Vietnam, as I mentioned before, you have seen Korean companies moving production from China to Vietnam, right? They think China has become too expensive, and they have moved facilities to Vietnam, right? Which will only accelerate with RCEP. And you actually, very interestingly, you see the export of South Korean products to the European market from three places: from South Korea itself, right? From factories in South Korea, from factories in Vietnam, right? So you might know this, but Samsung actually represents something like a third of all exports from Vietnam to the rest of the world is actually exports from Samsung, right? A single company, and many of them come to Europe, and then Korean companies are, well, not exporting, but are producing within the European within the European Union, right, to sell in the European market, right? So when you buy a Korean TV, for example, or car or mobile phone, it could have been produced in Korea, in Vietnam, or in Central Eastern Europe, right? And the components will come from different places. There will always be Korean components, but some components will come from Europe as well, for example, in some cases. In some other cases, they will come from other Asian countries. Now, what you have seen now with the pandemic is that the European Union is pressing very hard, along with the US, with the current administration in the US, not the previous one, but the current one, the Biden administration, for a so-called D10, G10, we don't know how it's going to be calling, and how it's going to be called, tech supply chain, right? And this would be the US, Canada, Australia, Japan, South Korea, maybe India as well, even though this is less likely, and European countries, right, creating their own production chain so they can actually bypass China, right? So to an extent, this is protectionism. It is protectionism against China. And going back to the point that was being made before, this is about politics. This is not necessarily about economics, because economically this maybe wouldn't make sense, but politically it makes sense if you don't trust Chinese tech goods, right? If you think they're going to be used for spying, for example, as some people think happens with Huawei, right? So interestingly, for South Korea, it is probably, well, I'm quite sure South Korean companies will join this network because it makes sense for them, because this allows them to withstand protectionism that you could have in the US, that you could have in Japan, or that you could have in Europe. It allows them to be part of these greater networks, right, with other Western and Asian firms from other Western and Asian countries. So they're going to be part of this production chains, and they're going to avoid protectionism, but also South Korean companies are very high tech, right? If you focus on semiconductors, for example, if you focus on flat screens, right? Now you have South Korean companies that have created rolling screens, right? So you have TVs that you can actually roll and put in a drawer, for example, and then take them out, right? So these very, very high tech goods, and as I mentioned before, they're already working on 6G, right? So for these companies, it makes sense to be part of these networks because they're going to be at the forefront of technological development. They're going to benefit from being part of this. But at the same time, South Korean companies are building factories in China to serve the Chinese consumer. I mean, this is the one of the big three, right? Along with the European Union and the US. It doesn't make sense for a South Korean company not to sell to Chinese consumers, especially after the pandemic, when China is going to grow much faster than, or is going to recover more quickly from the economic crisis coming out of the pandemic than the US and the European Union, right? So you have seen recently, for example, that I think it was Hyundai. They announced that they're going to open is it electric car factory in China or hydrogen car? I don't remember now. One of the two. I think it's electric vehicle factory in China to serve the Chinese market. And at the same time, they will have factories in South Korea that will be serving the international market, so to speak, right? And this use of two different production networks, right? One for the Chinese market, one, so to speak, for the rest of the world, accelerated. But probably this is what's going to happen. And this is what's happening with, this is what South Korean firms are doing. I would add one last point about this, that the South Korean government is very aware of the growth in protectionism. I mean, this is a thing that the government has been discussing, not only the current government, the previous one, with Park Geun-hye, he was also the government was discussing this, but protectionism clearly accelerated with the Trump administration in the US, right? So this has been discussed at the highest level in Chongqing, in the Blue House, right? In the Blue House is equivalent to Moncloa in Spain, right? And you see this discussion taking place. How do we, because South Korea is so dependent on exports, how do we prevent suffering from the protectionism that is taking place not only in China, for example, but in the US under the previous administration, maybe under the current one as well. So there has been this long-term thinking about how to address this. And the two solutions that the government has come up with, one, what I just mentioned, becoming part of these global production networks with other Western countries, and also potentially, with Australia, with Japan, other Asian countries as well, to avoid protectionism. And secondly, the increase in investment in technology, because if you have a high-tech good that no other country has, other countries will want to buy your good, right? Your high-tech good, even if they want to be protectionist, because they are not able to source this product from anywhere else, they will want to buy your good. And we have seen this with the semiconductor industry, right? Korean companies are actually the largest exporters in the world of semiconductors, right? Especially Samsung and SK Hynix, right? And even countries that want to be protectionist, they want to develop their own semiconductor industry, as China wants to do, for example, they have not been able to do this. They cannot compete with companies that are the frontier stage of technological development. So they have to keep on buying the semiconductors, as I said, especially from these two Korean companies, SK and Samsung, because they are not able to produce them themselves. So this is the other strategy the South Korean government is pursuing, right? Supporting private firms in their innovation as much as possible, so they produce goods that other countries will have no option but to acquire. This is done through universities, through research centers, and increasingly through startups in South Korea as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ramon. Oh, sorry, Jabin, I interrupted you. While here in the I was also thinking that I'm considering that South Korea also joined other big mega free trade agreements, such as the TPP with Canada and Japan and many other Pacific nations. The free trade agreement that former President Trump withdrew from. So it's clear that it's quite clear the strategy that you were, the Korean strategy that you were describing to us. There is a third question. Sarah Polo raised her hand. Sarah, the floor is entirely yours.
I just wanted to go back to the USA FTA. So which elements do you think that would have changed if North Korea would not have negotiated with the USA? Or if you want to say it differently, which do you think that were the most relevant points of the EU Republic of Korea agreement that were more influenced by the USA presence?
They were the first thing that happened with the US-Korea FTA is that this was a new generation FTA that covered all different sectors and also covered all different types of tariffs, non-tariff barriers, right? So this included labor standards, environmental standards, so all these different type of issues that I've mentioned, but also, for example, government procurement, right? So the government not discriminated against foreign companies, right? So at the European level, there was a discussion as to what extent it was willing to open its market in exchange for other countries also opening their market, right? And this hadn't been settled. And when the European Union look at the US-Korea FTA, the negotiation process, I started in 2006, if I remember correctly. So 1 year before no, it was 2006, must have been, 2006, 2007, right? They started back then during the Bush administration, before Obama came to office. So when you had the negotiation process, the European was still thinking, what issues are we going to incorporate into the FTA, right? And then the European decided to incorporate all the issues that the US was negotiating as well. So it's very likely that without the Chorus negotiation process, the European would have started by being less ambitious than it was in the end, right? When it incorporated all sorts of standards, as I said, government procurement, all sectors, right? So no place for the protection of any sector, let's say the agricultural sector. That is always very controversial. It's very political when it comes to FTAs, right? So that was one of the issues. But on the other hand, what happened as well is that the European was more willing to open up because South Korea went to the European and said, well, this is what the US has offered to us. And South Korea and the US actually signed the FTA before the EU launched its negotiations, a few months before the EU launch its negotiations, right? As I said, the US FTA later on took much longer to enter into force because of domestic politics in the US. But the agreement was signed by the time the UK, the EU, and the US, and the EU and South Korea launched their FTA. FTA negotiations. So that was something that South Korea was able to use. So, for example, when it came to investment measures, right? So essentially, the European Union cannot discriminate against any South Korean investor and any South Korean company that wants to open, for example, a facility, a factory in the European Union, but also that wants to export to the European Union. In the European Union was discussions about shall we allow state-owned enterprises to export to the European Union? Because, for example, if you look at KEPCO, the South Korean nuclear conglomerate, this is state-owned, right? It's not a private firm, right? So the European decided not to discriminate against this type of companies, even if they were state-owned, or if they have received support from the state as well, right? Which again, in the European, there was a discussion as to what extent shall we allow companies that receive state support to export to the European Union. Obviously, this has become much more politicized with China, right? But even back then, when the European Union was negotiating the FTA with the Republic of Korea, with South Korea, there was this discussion taking place. And the decision was a decision on the European side not to discriminate against this type of companies, for example, to allow investment to flow freely in both directions, but also into the European market. So that's essentially the way the way it happened. Actually, I think South Korean negotiators, what they did as well is that when they were having preparatory talks with the European Union for the FTA, they were finalizing the FTA with the US, negotiations with the FTA, right? And they used the text that was being negotiated with the US as a starting point for the negotiation position, right? The EU had its starting negotiation position, South Korea as well. And if you look at the final text of the FTA, it's very similar to the US Korea FTA, plus incorporating some of the European demands as well.
Okay, thank you for your answer. So it was of a binding importance, I guess.
It was because, yes, I mean, it was because, I mean, if the European had started negotiations in 2006, 2005, when South Korea first suggested them, then it would have had the upper hand. But back then, it was still thinking about its own policy, right? So this only happened afterwards. And I mean, this is not only for the EU or South Korea or the US, right? But any country that has negotiated an FTA tries to use the text that has agreed with other countries as a starting point. Among other things, because this is much more cost effective. You don't have to restart the negotiation process, right? So what I think would happen is that what happened is that both of them had their starting texts. In the case of South Korea, because it had been able to negotiate the FTA with the US first, that was their starting position. If it didn't have the FTA with the US, probably South Korea's starting position would have been far more difficult to establish, right? And the European would have been able to push more of its demands, right? I actually find interesting that actually, if you compare the EU-Korea FTA or the EU-Japan FTA, because they're very similar, and then you compare the Brexit agreement, actually, the agreement between the EU and the UK, you see many similarities when it comes to the idea of trading goods, right? So it's very interesting that for a trading partner that is more important for the European Union, such as the UK, right? But the European Union still use previous texts as the starting point of his negotiation process when it came to trading goods with a much closer negotiation partner, right? So you see the influence of previous FTAs.
So true, Ramon. To negotiate an FTA may take many years. So that's I don't remember. I actually do not have the figures in mind in relation to Korea and the European Union, but in relation to the CETA with Canada, I think I'm not wrong if I say that it took 7 or 8 years before concluding the negotiations. So this idea of trying to be as cost effective as possible that you highlighted, it's very, very relevant as well. Thank you for your question, Sarah, and for your comprehensive answer, Ramon. Again, it's a pleasure to hear to you talking about these topics. Do we have any other question, people? Is there any other question in the audience? I think we shall take the silence as a negative answer. Before concluding the session, Ramon, I cannot prevent myself to ask you, what is the Korean Foundation? Because in your introduction, we presented you. I mean, you're the director of this Korea Chair in the Brussels School of Governance, which is a co-project or a project co-founded or co-supported by the Vrije Universiteit Brussels. We know what is the Vrije Universiteit is, but we don't know what the Korean Foundation is. Could you please give us a very, very short description of what this Korea Foundation is? We're interested.
Yes, I was thinking we don't have an equivalent in Spain that I could compare it to, right? I mean, it's a government institution actually to promote knowledge and debate about Korea. Both Koreas actually. It's a South Korean institution, but it promotes knowledge and debate about both Koreas, right? Launched in the 1990s, and back then it was really about history, right? Learning more about Korean history. These days it's not about history, it's really more about the social sciences and understanding contemporary South Korea and contemporary Korean Peninsula issues. And actually it might be interesting for students because they offer funding, among other things, they offer funding for foreign students who want to spend a period of time in South Korea studying, learning the language. And I mention this because I've realized over the years that more and more Spanish students go to Korea or obviously also to Japan, China as well, right? And they spend some time there. So I think that that's the main goal and that's the main interest, I guess, from a student perspective, right? That they promote knowledge about Korea, but it allows to spend time there, you know, to study the language or to study a master's degree there, for example, or to spend some time there. And I mean, even though it's funded by the government, it's fairly it's independent in the way it is run. So what I like about it is that you can be critical about the country as well, which is not always the case with foundations, right? They want you to say nice things about the country. That's not necessarily the case with the Korea Foundation. I think maybe it would be not. Well, it's not really the Cervantes Institute, because Cervantes is more about the cultures of Spain, right? And that's maybe more the Kim Institute in the case of Korea, but it has that component as well of promoting knowledge about the other overseas.
Okay, thank you very much. I was just curious about this institution. If there is no final question, and I think there is none, we thank you very much, Ramon, Professor Ramon Pacheco, from the Korea Chair in the Institute of Governance, in the Brussels Institute of Governance of the Vrije Universiteit Brussels, and also lecturing at King's College in London. Thank you very much, Kamsahamnida.
Thank you, Kamsahamnida.